Main text of Zhang Ailing's Half-Life Chapter 15. When the August 13th anti-Japanese war began, fighting continued for 3 months in Shanghai, and many wealthy people panicked and fled to the mainland. Manzhen's mother is in Suzhou, and people in Suzhou are also panicked. Although Mrs. Gu was not a wealthy person, she was also affected by their swarm. People fled to the upper reaches of the Yangtze River, and she also fled to their place of origin in Luan. By this time their old lady had passed away. Mrs. Gu was a daughter-in-law until she was in her 50s or 60s. She usually complained behind her back, but the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law had always been together through hardships, so they felt like they were always with her. The old lady died, and she was left alone. Several children were not around. One girl was studying nursing in Suzhou, and the 2 younger ones were sponsored by their brother to go to school. Wyman teaches in Shanghai and is married. Mrs. Gu returned to Luan. Their family had tiled houses outside the city. They were originally used by grave caretakers, but now they have taken them back for their own use. Not long after she came back, Eugen came to her house to see her. He wanted to ask her about Manzhen's current situation. He wrote to Manzhen many times, but they all came back undeliverable, because he knew about the dispute between Manzhen and the Shu family. He felt that Mrs. Gu had always been willing to compromise. Even Manzhen was locked up by the Shu family for a long time, which seemed to have her approval. Regardless of whether she had the heart to betray her daughter or was fooled, Eugen was somewhat contemptuous of her anyway. After meeting him, his expression was very cold. When Mrs. Gu first saw him, she was extremely affectionate, like meeting an old friend in a foreign country. After talking for a while, Eugen asked, "Where is Manzhen now?" Mrs. Gu said, "She is still in Shanghai. She is married." "Oh, Manlu died. You know, Manzhen was married to Hong Kai." Mrs. Gu said these words very well, as if it was natural for Manzhen to marry her brother-in-law. It was expected that Eugen might not know the hidden meaning, but she felt guilty about this matter and thought it was a stain on the family. So I just mentioned it once, and then talked about it elsewhere. When Eugen heard the news, although it was not completely unexpected, it was still very exciting. He really felt sorry for Manzhen. Mrs. Gu talked to him as much as she could, and he just said a few perfunctory words, then said he had something else to do, and left. He only came once. "I don't come to pay my respects during the Chinese New Year, and I don't come to pay my respects during the holidays." Mrs. Gu was very angry and thought to herself, "It's so unreasonable. I didn't expect him to be so snobbish. When he came to Shanghai, he didn't always live in our house. Now that I'm poor, he doesn't even recognize my relatives." The war has come to an end. Mrs. Gu has been undecided and wants to go to Shanghai. It is difficult to walk on the road at this time. She is alone. Old Anne has no one to look after her along the way. Later I couldn't leave even if I wanted to. Shanghai had already fallen by this time. The news of the fall of Luan was written off in the newspaper. Luan was originally a small place, and the newspaper published the news in just a few lines, and never mentioned it again. Manzhen and Wyman Jimin were naturally very worried, wondering if Mrs. Gu was still safe there. Wyman received a letter from Mrs. Gu. In fact, this letter was sent before the fall of Japan, so he still didn't know her current situation. But he still passed the letter round, showed it to Jimin, and called him send it to Manzhen to see. Jimin now works in a bank. He only studied in college for 1 year before joining this bank. On this day he came to Ju's house. Rongbao liked this little uncle the most. As soon as he came, he stayed in front of him and refused to leave. The weather was hot, and Jimin was only wearing a white shirt and a pair of yellow khaki shorts. As soon as he sat down, Rongbao was leaning against Manzhen. Suddenly he turned around and called Mom. Manzhen responded, "Huh?" Rongbao was silent again. After a while, she raised her face and said quietly, "Mom, my uncle has a scar on his leg." Manzhen looked at Jimin's knee and couldn't help laughing and said, "I remember your scar has never been this big before. People grow." The scar grew bigger and bigger. Jimin lowered his head and touched his knee, and said with a smile, "This was when I was learning to ride a bicycle and fell." At this point, he suddenly felt as if he had think about it. Manzhen asked him if the bank was busy. but he just responded casually, then suddenly beat his leg with his fist and said with a smile, "I said I have something to tell you. I forgot about it when I saw you. I met someone that day. Guess who it was? I met Shen Shijin." It was also because he was learning to ride a bicycle at that time, and it was Shijin who taught him how to ride. It reminded him of it, seeing that Manzin was stunned. As if he didn't understand what he said. He said again, "Shen Shijin. He came to our bank to open an account, and he has been here twice." Manzin smiled and said, I actually know him," Jimin said, "otherwise I wouldn't have recognized him. I only remembered his name when I saw it. I didn't even say hello to him. Of course he didn't recognize me. He saw how old was I at that time. After saying that, he pointed at Rong Bao and said with a smile, "I'm just as old as him." Manzin also laughed. She really wanted to ask him what Shijin was like now. The words were on her lips, but before she could say them, Jimin leaned over, took out Mrs. Gu's letter from his trouser pocket, and handed it to her to read. He also talked about things in their industry and said that he might be transferred to Zhenjiang next month. After a few disagreements, it was hard for Manzin to mention that matter again. In fact, there is nothing to be embarrassed about. Asking what's the big deal? He was her lover many years ago. Now she is in her 30s. The child is so old, especially in the eyes of her younger brother. She is already very old. Already, but precisely because of this, she was even more embarrassed to act so affectionate in front of him. She read her mother's letter and had nothing to say. They said a few words of comfort to each other, but everyone had this feeling in their hearts. If her mother suffered misfortune, everyone would inevitably blame themselves for not persisting at that time, ask her to come to Shanghai. Of course, Jimin has no choice. He has no place to live. He lives in a bank dormitory. Wyman's place was also very crowded, with a total of one private room, and a mother-in-law living with them. His mother-in-law's only daughter had agreed when they got married that she would live with them and rely on her husband for life. Manzin was different from him. She didn't have the strength to pick up her mother. Since the fall of Japan, only businessmen have made money easily, so Hong Sai's situation has improved in the past 2 years. He built a new house with 2 upper floors and 2 lower floors. It would be convenient for Mrs. Gu to live there, but Manzin doesn't want her to come. Manzin rarely sees her 2 younger brothers. She doesn't interact with anyone and wishes she could hide herself in a dark hole. She herself always had a sense of uncleanness. Hong Kai was very disappointed with her. In the past, she always seemed to be out of reach. I had been thinking about her for 2 years. Even after I got her, I still felt in a daze. I never felt that he possessed her. Once she married him, she would no longer be interested in him, and she would even think that he had been deceived. It was like a bowl of vegetarian shrimps, which looked like shrimps, but were actually made of yams, which looked a little dull. There is no taste either. He first thought that at least she was pretty good in the field, and having a wife like her would be very honorable. So for a period of time he often forced her to go out to socialize with him, but now she is simply not able to do it. Compared with them, they're not outstanding at all. She had no intention of grooming at all. Her complexion was sallow, she always had a sickly look, and her clothes were not fashionable. She was always silent when she saw people. Sometimes she couldn't hear what people said, and there was often a dull look in her eyes. Stupid look. Why did she become a different person when she got into his hands? Hong Kai really felt resentful. So he always makes noise with her. No matter how fierce the quarrel was, Manzin never broke the old score with him, saying that she didn't marry him voluntarily. It was also because she was afraid that remembering the past would only make her sadder. If she didn't mention it, of course he would forget it. Originally, once you get married, what happened before the marriage becomes insignificant. No matter who pursued whom at the beginning, after marriage, whoever is unreasonable will have the upper hand. Hong Kai was always provoking her all day long, and Manzin rarely argued with him. She felt that she was lying alone in the mud, and there was nothing else worth arguing about. Nothing matters much. It has been more than 10 days since Lewin fell, and the exchange has not been cleared. The situation there must be still very chaotic. Manzin wanted to send some money to her mother, and she wanted to ask Jimin if the remittance went through. It was not convenient to say this on the phone, so she had to go there herself and hand the money to him. If he could remit it, he would do it. They're a small branch, and the staff quarters are upstairs of the bank, accessible through the back door. Manzin deliberately waited until after they got off work that day because she heard Jimin say last time that Shijin had been to their business and she was afraid of meeting him. In fact, he was the one who was sorry for her at the beginning, but after all these years, she no longer thinks of that. She only feels that the life she is living now is that she is sorry for herself. Maybe she still hates him a little because she doesn't want his mercy. This is always the hot autumn weather, but it was a little cooler in the evening this day because Manzin didn't go out often. Although Hunkai had a tricycle of her own, she never took his. She took the tram to Himin's place, got off the tram, and walked on the road. The lighting sky and the cool breeze blew up on her body. It must have rained somewhere else. She often thought of Shijin in the past 2 days. Thinking of him reminded her of herself when she was young. At that time, she went out to teach every night, and Shijin sent her there. Just walking on the road like this. The two people seemed so close to her that she could touch them if she stretched out her hands. Sometimes she felt that the wind was blowing on the corners of their clothes, and then drifting to her body. It seemed like he was right next to her, but there was already a mountain of mountains between them. The front door of Himin's bank faces the street, and the back door opens into an alley. Manzin remembered that it was No. 509. She recognized it by recognizing the house number along the way. There was a shop near the entrance of the alley, with a red neon sign high up, and the entrance of the alley was quietly bathed in red light. Someone came out of the alley. He couldn't see clearly in the red light, but Manzin was surprised. Maybe the walking posture was a little familiar, but she and Shijin hadn't seen each other for 10 years. And if she hadn't thought of him there, she would never have recognized it was him at once. It's him. She quickly turned her face away and faced the window. He probably didn't see her. Of course, he wouldn't pay much attention to a passing woman if he didn't know that there was a chance of meeting her here. Manzin didn't expect that he would go to the bank at such a late hour. Because he always arrived late, he had to go in through the back door and ask a bank clerk he knew well to accommodate him. This is what Manzin thought about later. At that time, she seemed to be in a state of confusion. She just knew that he was the person she least wanted to see in the world. She turned around and walked west along the road. He seemed to be walking westward too. She heard footsteps behind her and thought it might be him. Although she still believed that he had not seen her, she became even more panicked. Unfortunately, there was not a single tricycle. There was a performance at a theater nearby, and all the tricycles were there. Also, because of the breakup of the opera, there were cars one after another on the street, making it impossible to cross the road. The man behind walked faster and faster, and actually started running. Manzin was confused for a moment when she saw a bus coming with a rumble. There was a stop in front of her, so she ran forward to get on the bus. After running a few steps, she suddenly saw Shijin passing by her and passing in front of her. It turned out that he was not chasing her, but the bus. Manzin stood firm, and it seemed that the danger had passed. She couldn't help but want to see if it was Shijin, because it was too much like a dream, and she couldn't believe it. In this section, there are 2 leather shoe shops with bright lights in their windows, which shine onto the street. The light is also very bright, and you can see very clearly what kind of clothes Shijin is wearing and what his face looks like. Although it all happens in an instant, you can always feel whether he has gained weight or lost weight, whether he seems to be very rich or not very proud. But Manzin didn't know why, and had no impression at all. He only saw Shijin, and his heart was already shaking, with bursts of happiness and sadness. His body seemed to be floating in the sea, and he didn't know where it was. She just stared blankly over there. In fact, the bus had already left, but Shijin was still standing there. It was because the bus was too crowded and he couldn't get on, so he had to wait for the next one. The next car was coming from the east, so he naturally turned around and looked east, exactly towards Manzin. She suddenly felt it. If he turned around and walked back immediately, it would be too sudden, but it would attract attention. With this thought, there was no time to think about it. so he hurriedly crossed the road and walked to the opposite street. At this time, the car's long line of snakes became looser, but suddenly a truck came, and it was immediately in front of us. The two headlights on the front of the car were dazzling with white light, and the front of the car was magnified. But no matter how big it was as big as a room, and it was like a dark room rushing towards her. She didn't know much about what happened next. She only heard a long scream of Zhio, which stopped the car, and then she heard the driver yelling curses. Manzan's legs were shaking so much that she couldn't stand, but she quickly walked to the opposite street. Fortunately, she met a tricycle not long after walking. She got on it. The car had already crossed several roads, and she felt still beating wildly. I don't know if it was hysteria after being frightened, but her tears flowed like springs. She really wanted to die, no matter if she was hit by a car. It started to rain, and heavy raindrops hit her body, but she didn't ask the driver to stop and pull up the hood. She returned home and walked to the bedroom upstairs. Because of the rain, the windows were all closed tightly, and she felt warm when she walked in. She didn't even turn on the light, so she lay down on the bed. In the dark room, only a mirror on the wardrobe shone with some light. Some of the furniture in the room were bought when she and Hong Kai got married, and some were added later. In that depressing air, all the furniture seemed to be crowded so close together that she felt like she couldn't breathe. This is the hole she dug herself to bury herself in. She fell on the bed and just cried. Suddenly the light came on and it was Hong Kai who came back. Manzan turned over and fell asleep. Hong Kai came back very early today. He rarely went home for dinner, and Manzan never asked him. She also knew that he was playing hard outside again. It was raining today, and he was too lazy to go out, so he came back early. He walked to the bed, sat down, took off his shoes, and put on slippers, and asked casually, "Why are you lying here alone, huh?" After saying this, he put his hand on her knee and squeezed it. He didn't know why today, but he seemed to have a good impression of her. At this time, she needed so much strength to suppress her hatred, and she had no strength left at all. She lay there motionless and silent. Hong Kai thought it was too hot in the room, so he put on his slippers and went downstairs. There was a fan in the living room that he could use. Manzan was lying on the bed. Although the window in the room was closed, she could still hear a family's radio in the alley. Ding Ding Dong Dong was playing the pipa, and a middle-aged man sang there with a slightly feminine accent. The singing voice was murmuring, but it was not very clear. The sound of the pipa was originally like the sound of rain, but in this rainy weather, listening to it from a distance through the rain, it even revealed a sense of desolation. As soon as it rained, the weather became cold the next day. In order to remit money to her mother, Manzan was about to call Jimin and ask him to come to her place after work. But suddenly she received a call from Wyman saying that Mrs. Gu had arrived in Shanghai and was now in there he is. As soon as Manzan heard this, he rushed to his home, and immediately the mother and daughter met. When Mrs. Gu came out this time, she suffered a lot along the way. She took a wheelbarrow, but the man pushing the wheelbarrow was pulled away by the husband. She walked 100 miles. The weather turned cold today, and I froze again on the train. I kept coughing and my throat became hoarse. But since arriving in Shanghai, I haven't stopped talking, because when I first arrived, Wyman hadn't come back yet. So she couldn't help but she first narrated the experience to her daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. When Wyman came back, she narrated it again. When Wyman called Jimin, she told him again. Now she told Manzan that it was the third time, 4 times. It turns out that Luan was recaptured after its fall. Naturally, the newspapers in the occupied area did not mention it. Mrs. Gu was in Luan. She originally lived outside the city. The house had been destroyed by 2 wars and had long since been reduced to the ground. She stayed at the house of a cousin in the city. When the Japanese soldiers entered the city, there was a lot of rape and robbery as usual. Fortunately, her brother-in-law's family only consisted of an old couple. They had little savings, so the losses were not big. Luan only fell for 10 days in total, and then was recaptured. Taking advantage of the calmer time, she was anxious to go to Shanghai. It happened that several people from her own city were leaving, so she found a man who was familiar with the road as a guide. So she went with them to Shanghai. She found Wyman's house. Wyman and his wife only lived in one room, and a small room was separated by a wooden wall as a place for his mother-in-law, Mrs. Tao, to stay. When Mrs. Tao saw Mrs. Gu, she felt a little ashamed, feeling that she was being taken over by Nestle. She entertained her mother-in-law very enthusiastically, even more enthusiastically than her daughter. But she had to be careful not to be too attentive and turn against the guests, or make the other party feel unhappy. So she was in a dilemma. Mrs. Gu only felt that her attitude was very unnatural. Sometimes she was affectionate, and sometimes she was indifferent. Wyman's wife's name is Wanju. Although Wanju has a good attitude on the surface, Mrs. Gu always feels that she is the only one they care about. Later, Wyman came back, and the mother and son talked for a while. He originally thought that when his mother arrived, he shouldn't cry about poverty immediately, but during a casual conversation, he couldn't help but talk about it. Teachers' salary has always been difficult, especially now that prices have soared, making it even more difficult to make ends meet. Wan Shu interjected from the side and said that she also wanted to go out to work and earn some money to supplement the family income. Wyman said, "In Shanghai now, it is really difficult to find a job, but it is easy to get rich, so there are so many nouveau rich." Mrs. Tao said nothing. What Mrs. Tao meant was that her daughter's search for trouble was secondary. Even if she found trouble, it would not save the poor, but Wyman, he should make up his mind. Since they have such a wealthy aunt, and Zhu Hongkai is now doing business to make money, he can also take him with him. They are all one of their own. So why not support him? Mrs. Tao always thinks like this, so every time she sees Manzan, she always feels a little sour and unhappy. On this day Manzan came and everyone sat and talked for a while. Manzan looked at this look and realized that her mother and Mrs. Tao could not get along. Basically, two old ladies lived together and each had their own fixed living habits, so it would be difficult to find a suitable one. The place here is really small, Manzan said. Shin had no choice but to say that she would take her mother to live with her. Wyman said, "That's fine. Your place is more spacious so Mom can have a good rest." Mrs. Gu followed Manzan back. When they arrived at Zhu's house, Hongkai hadn't come back yet, so Mrs. Gu asked Manzan, "What kind of business is my uncle doing now? Is it going smoothly?" Manzan said, "I really can't stand what they are doing now. Either hoarding rice or medicine. These are all unconscionable things." Mrs. Gu didn't expect that she was still the same as before, with an angry tone when mentioning Hongkai. At the moment, she could only laugh and said, "This is the current world. What can I do?" Manzan said nothing. Mrs. Gu saw that she was always listless and had a yellow color on her face, so she frowned and asked, "How is your health?" "Well, you used to do things, working from morning to night, which made your body tired." "Yes, at that time, I was young and could handle it, but when I got older, I felt it." Manzan didn't argue with her. Speaking of work, it was also a sore. She had agreed with Hongkai in advance that she would continue to work after marriage. At that time, Hongkai was of course very obedient, but he always felt uneasy when she was working outside, and later he started to make trouble for her. "I resigned, and I don't know how many times I argued about this matter. Finally, she quit the job because she was extremely tired." Mrs. Gu said, "Just now at your brother's house, your sister-in-law said that if you want to find a job, you can also supplement the family income. They said they didn't have enough money. And those words were all told to me. Mother-in-law takes over to live at home. Shouldn't she spend money? It's really boring to think about raising a son." As he said this, he couldn't help but sigh. Rong Bao came back from school. When Mrs. Gu saw him, she pulled him and asked, "Do you still recognize me?" "Who am I?" Then she smiled at Manzan and said, "Who do you think he looks like?" The longer he gets, the more he looks like him. It looks like just like his grandpa. Manzan said a little confused, "Like Dad." The father in her memory was a thin face with a mustache, but the him in her mother's memory was probably very different. Or he looked like a young man, and it was easy to see his shadow in all the lovely features. Manzan couldn't help but smile. Manzan asked the maid to buy snacks. Mrs. Gu said, "You don't have to bother me. I don't want to eat anything. I just want to lie down for a while. Manzin said, but are you tired from the journey? Mrs. Gu said, well, I feel quite uncomfortable at this time. Lu, the bed was ready, so Manzin accompanied her upstairs. When Mrs. Gu lay down, Manzin sat in front of the bed and talked to her. Because she also talked about her experience in the dangerous city. She never mentioned Yujin, but Manzin kept thinking about him, because she said, I heard a few days ago that they were beaten to Liuan. I was really anxious, thinking that my mother would be there alone. And then I thought about Yujin, he's also there, maybe I can take care of him a little bit. Mrs. Gu sighed and said, forget about Yujin. He only came here once when I arrived in Liuan. At this point, he suddenly remembered and leaned up on the pillow. Said softly, hey, did you know that his young mistress died and he was arrested? Manzin was taken aback and said, ah, how can it be so good? Mrs. Gu insisted on starting from the beginning. First, she recounted how she and Yujin were vomiting, which made Manzin anxious to death. She continued talking in an orderly manner, saying that she would not go to him if he didn't come, and added, I didn't mention this at your brother's place just now. The Tao family heard it, and it seems that even our relatives here look down on us. Let's not talk about it now. When the war started, the news became more and more serious. I lived alone outside the city, and he didn't even bother to ask. Well, later the Japanese came in and arrested him. The nurses in the hospital were all gang raped, and they said that his young mistress was also raped, and she lost her life just like that. Oh, when I heard this, I was really... People don't see me, a poor cousin, in their eyes. What do I think about his appearance? Damn it, this nephew and his daughter-in-law never interacted with each other. But why did they die so miserably, even after Yujin was arrested? I don't know what happened. During the 2 days I left, the city was in chaos, and all the machines in the hospital were destroyed, moved away just because I fancy his machine. Manzin stayed for a long time and then said quietly, tomorrow I will go to Yujin's father-in-law's house to ask. Maybe they will know more clearly. Mrs. Gu said, his father-in-law's house. I heard him say that his father-in-law's family went to the mainland. Not because of the war in Shanghai at that time. Many people left. Manzin was speechless for another long time. Yujin is the only one who cares about her, and he may no longer be alive. She was sitting there in a daze when Mrs. Gu suddenly came forward, reached out and touched her forehead, and then her own forehead. She frowned and didn't say anything, then lay down again. Manzin said, what's wrong, Mom? Are you a little feverish? Mrs. Gu hummed in response. Manzin said, should I ask a doctor to come and take a look? Mrs. Gu said, no, I just caught a cold on the road, and I'll be fine with a pack of afternoon tea. Manzin found the afternoon tea, and he asked the maid to cook, and asked Rong Bao to go downstairs and play, so as not to disturb Grandma. Rong Bao was playing with origami airplanes alone in the living room. Jimin taught him that day. He could throw them and fly very far. He threw it, then ran after it, panting and laughing, squatting on the ground, picking it up and throwing it again. Hong Kai happened to come in. Rong Bao called Dad, stood up and walked back. Hong Kai couldn't help but feel angry and said, why did you run away when you saw me? Don't leave. He felt really sad, thinking that this child only knew his mother since she came. Rong Bao huddled behind the sofa and was dragged out by Hong Kai, shouting, why are you so scared like a kid when you see me? Say it, say it. Rong Bao burst into tears. Hong Kai scolded, why are you crying? I didn't beat you. If you make me angry, I will beat you. Manzin heard the child crying upstairs and hurried downstairs. When he saw Hong Kai beating the child as soon as he came back, he went to pull the child and said, what are you doing? It's for no reason. Hong Sai's nose turned up. He shouted with eyes, I can beat him if he is my son. He is my son after all, isn't he? Manzin was so angry that he trembled with anger, but he didn't bother to talk to him, so he just pulled the child as hard as he could. Pulled him over. Hong Kai hurriedly beat him a few times and said bitterly, I don't know who taught him, but he looks like an enemy when he sees me. A maid ran in and tried to persuade Rong Bao was taken away, but Rong Bao was still crying. The maid called him, don't make trouble, Don't make trouble. I'll take you to Grandma's house. After hearing this, Hong Kai was startled and said, "What did she say? Is his grandma here?" He looked at Manzin, but Manzin just looked coldly and went upstairs without saying anything. The maid said outside, "The old lady is here. She's upstairs." Hong Kai heard that a visitor from afar was coming, so he didn't lose his temper anymore. So he straightened his clothes and rolled up his clothes. He put down his sleeves and immediately stepped up the stairs. He heard Mrs. Gu coughing, so he walked into the back room and saw Mrs. Gu there alone. He called out, "Mom." Mrs. Gu hurriedly sat up from the bed. After greetings, Mrs. Gu told him to listen to this escape of the process. She asked about Hong Sai's current situation again, and Hong Kai lamented his hardships to her, saying that nowadays, with a high standard of living, he could never make ends meet. But he always had this temper. After complaining for a while, he was afraid that people would think he was really poor. So he quickly showed off and said that he and some friends had dinner at a Chinese restaurant that day. The 5 of them could eat whatever they wanted. Lost a staggering amount of money. Manzin never came in. The maid came in with a bowl of afternoon tea. Hong Kai asked and found out that Mrs. Gu was not feeling well, so he said, "Mom, rest for a few more days. When she gets better, I will invite her to the theater." Shanghai is more lively now than before. The maid came to treat her to dinner. Today, she will invite her to dinner. The meal was served upstairs to avoid Mrs. Gu having to go upstairs and downstairs, and porridge was also prepared for her, but Mrs. Gu said she couldn't eat any of it, so it was still the 2 of them and their children who ate together. Rong Bao had already been wiped by Manzin, and his eyelids were still a little red and swollen. It was too quiet at the dinner table, and the sound of chewing seemed strangely loud. The 3 people sat around a square table, as if there was a dark cloud hanging heavily over their heads, as if there was an umbrella above their heads. Hong Kai suddenly said, "This cook is really bad. What does this dish look like?" Manzin was speechless. After a while, Hong Kai said angrily, "There is absolutely nothing edible about this dish." Manzin still ignored him. There was a bowl of fish soup placed far away. Rong Bao couldn't pick it up. He stood up and stretched out his arms to pick it up. However, Hong Kai stretched out his chopsticks and hit him on the waist. He cursed, "Look! You don't eat well. There are no rules at all." With a snap, Rong Bao's chopsticks fell on the table, and his tears also fell on the tablecloth. Manzin knew that Hong Kai was deliberately looking for trouble. He didn't think he was going to break her heart, so he had to start with the child. She continued to eat her meal indifferently, without saying a word. Rong Bao was used to this, so he picked up the chopsticks while sobbing. He picked up the rice bowl again and took 2 mouthfuls of rice, but there was a large piece of fish with no bones on the belly. It was brought to his bowl. Manzin picked it for him. He had stopped crying, but for some reason, tears started flowing down again. Manzin thought to herself that if this continued, the child would definitely suffer from indigestion. This happens almost every day when eating. It was simply unbearable, but Hong Kai seemed unable to bear the pressure of the air and wanted to leave the table as quickly as possible. He had only half a bowl of rice left, so he just wanted to finish it all in one go. He raised his head, raised his rice bowl, and almost covered his face with the rice bowl. He picked up the rice impatiently, and his chopsticks made a sound like a pelting rain. He always does this when he is about to finish his meal. He has several habitual little actions. For example, when he blows his nose, he always presses the wings of his nose with one finger and snorts into the ground with the other nostril, making a short snort. In fact, this is nothing, and it cannot be said to be a bad habit. However, Manzin has now developed a very bad habit. Every time she sees his small movements, her face immediately starts to convulse with disgust. She can feel the muscles under her eyes pulling upwards. A wrinkle. There was nothing she could do to stop herself. Hong Sai's chopsticks were still tapping the bottom of the bowl, but Manzin had already put down his rice bowl, stood up, and walked to the back room. When Mrs. Gu saw her walking in, she pretended to be asleep. Of course, Mrs. Gu heard clearly what was said in the room outside. Although she didn't say a few words in total, All she heard was the cold silence, but she could also know that the two of them were not vomiting overnight. With quarrels like this all day long, it is really difficult for the guests who come to their home to deal with themselves. Mrs. Gu then thought that although Hong Kai had welcomed her very much just now, her relatives had always been scented far away and smelly. And it might be a different matter if she lived here for a long time. From the looks of it, it would be better to live with my son. Although they have a mother-in-law living there, and everyone is at odds with each other, which is very annoying. But no matter what, it is justifiable for me to live there, and I feel happier after all. So Mrs. Gu decided to return to Wyman as soon as she recovered from her illness. However, her illness never got better and she lay in bed for more than a week. There was never a day without quarrels here in Manzan, and Mrs. Gu didn't dare to get involved in trying to persuade them, so she had to pretend to be indifferent. She wanted to persuade Manzan behind her back, but although she was well-versed in the art of motherhood and husband control, she found it difficult to speak in front of Manzan. She also knew that Manzan's feelings for her were limited now, and all that was left was a sense of responsibility. Mrs. Gu's illness was finally cured and she was able to get up and walk around. However, her appetite was not very good and she was constantly chirping and feeling uncomfortable. Manzan said that she should find a doctor for a test. Mrs. Gu refused at first, saying that it was not worth going to a doctor for such a small matter. Later, she heard that Manzan said that there was a Dr. Wei with whom Hong Kai was very familiar. Mrs. Gu felt that doctors she knew well were more reliable and could see more carefully. Manzan accompanied her that afternoon. Dr. Wei's clinic is located in a building. There are many tricycles parked at the door. Many tricycle drivers are standing there. Manzan glances at Chun Yuan, her own driver, standing there. When he sees Manzan, he seems to be stunned. He was stunned for a moment and did not greet her immediately. Manzan felt a little strange, thinking that he might be driving passengers outside to make extra money behind his back, and brought an unrelated person here, so he felt guilty. She ignored it at the time and walked in with her mother and took the elevator upstairs. Dr. Wei's business is very good, and the waiting room is full of people. After Manzan registered, she found a seat for her mother and sat down on a chair by the window. While she stood by the window, there were only two people sitting on the sofa opposite, a man and a little girl. There was still a lot of free space on the sofa, but according to general custom, a woman would not go and sit between them. The little girl was about 11 or 12 years old, with a long face and yellow-white skin. She seemed to be very weak. She was sitting there very bored. She held a man's felt hat in front of her chest and slowly rotated it, but exposed an air of gentleness. Presumably it was always her father's hat. The person sitting next to her reading the newspaper was always her father. Manzan couldn't help but look at them twice, feeling that this scene had a family meaning. The man reading the newspaper was covered by the newspaper, and only his robes, pants, shoes and socks were visible, and they all seemed familiar. Manzan was stunned for a moment. Hong Kai went out wearing this set of clothes in the morning. Is he here to see a doctor, or does he have something to do with Dr. Wei? Maybe he took this kid to see a doctor. Could it be his own child? No wonder Chun Yuan met Chun Yuan at the gate just now. Chun Yuan seemed to have seen a ghost when he saw her. When she and her mother walked in, Hong Kai must have seen them, so he kept holding a newspaper and didn't dare to show his face. Manzan didn't want to expose him on the spot. What's the point of making such a fuss in front of so many people? And with her mother present, she didn't want her mother to get involved and cause a lot of trouble. From the window of this building, you can see very far away. Manzan pointed and said, "Mom, come and see. That's where we used to live, right behind the church spire. Do you see it?" Gu, the wife, stood next to her and looked down from the window together. Manzan was talking, and she seemed to see the man reading the newspaper standing up and going out. She turned around sharply, and the man turned his back quickly, looking at the doctor's certificate hanging on the wall with his hands behind his back. It was clearly Hong Sai's back. Hong Kai just raised his head and looked at the framed doctor's certificate. The glass of the frame was dark, but it reflected the movements of the two people outside the window. Manzin turned away again and leaned at the window with Mrs. Gu, looking at the street below. Hong Kai saw it in the frame and left quickly. Unexpectedly, at this moment, Mrs. Gu turned around again, closed her eyes, and said with a smile, "Hey, I feel dizzy looking down here." She left the window and sat down in her original seat. I happened to see Hong Sai's back walking out in a hurry, but he didn't pay attention to it. But the little girl shouted, "Dad, where are you going?" When she called, the patients sitting in the waiting room felt bored, so they all looked at Hong Kai. Mrs. Gu exclaimed and said to Manzin, "That's Hong Kai." Hong Kai knew he couldn't escape, so he turned around and said with a smile, "Hey, you guys are here too." Mrs. Gu heard the little girl. It felt very strange to call him daddy, and he was stunned and speechless for a moment. Manzin was speechless. Hong Kai also froze, and after a while he smiled and said, "This is my goddaughter, Lao He's girl." Then he looked at Manzin and smiled. "Oh, did I tell you? This is Lao. He must marry me." Everyone in the room looked at them, including the little girl. Hong Kai said again, "They know that I know Dr. Wei, so they must ask me to bring her to see. This child has a stomachache. Hey, how did you come here? Did you come with your mother?" He ordered again himself. He nodded and said solemnly, "Hey, Mom should see Dr. Wei. He is very careful in his treatment." He felt a little panicked and talked a lot. Mrs. Gu could only say weakly, "Manzin insisted that I come and take a look. In fact, I'm fine." The doctor's door opened and a patient walked out. A nurse followed him and called out, "Mr. Zhu." It was Hong Sai's turn. He smiled and said, "Then I'll go in first." Then he took the child and walked in. The child was a little afraid of seeing a doctor. She was holding Hong Sai's hat in her hands, and one hand was held by Hong Kai. Only took 2 steps, suddenly turned around and shouted to a woman next to him, "Mom, Mom is coming too." The woman was sitting on a sofa chair next to them, and she had been immersed in reading a picture magazine there. After being called like this by her, he had to put down the pictorial and stand up. Hong Kai seemed very embarrassed. He didn't have time to explain at that time, so he went in with the woman and the child. Mrs. Gu coughed lightly in her throat and glanced at Manzin. The sofa was now empty, so Manzin walked over and sat down. He waved to Mrs. Gu and said with a smile, "Mom, please sit over here, please." Mrs. Gu followed her without saying a word and sat down side by side with her. Manzin picked up a newspaper and read it. She wasn't pretending to be calm either. She didn't feel much excitement when she discovered that there was another woman outside Hong Kai. Nothing could stimulate her feelings anymore. She just felt completely tired from their entire painful relationship. She just thought about what if he had such a daughter outside, or his son. If he has more than one son, Rong Bao, then if they get divorced, maybe Rong Bao can be brought up by her. She has had the idea of divorce for a long time. Mrs. Gu held the bronze medal of the clinic in her hand and fiddled with it to herself. She glanced at Manzin from time to time and coughed lightly. Manzin thought to herself that she would send her mother back later today and go to Yang's house if she had the chance. Over the years, she had cut off all her friends because she was unwilling to interact with others. Only the young family where she used to teach, and the 2 children, had always been very good to her. They have 2 children, a boy and a girl. The boy has graduated from college and works as an assistant at a lawyer. She wanted to ask him to introduce him and talk to their lawyer. It's better to have an introduction from an acquaintance, so as not to rip you off too much. The small white door leading to the doctor's room was closed tightly, and the few people who entered could not come out. Dr. Wei, probably for the sake of Hong Sai's friendship, watched him very carefully, and chatted with Hong Kai, leaving the patients outside waiting. After a while, the door opened, and 3 people filed out. This time Mrs. Gu and Manzin saw it very clearly. The woman must be over 30 years old, with a date-core face, charming little eyes, bright red rouge smeared straight to her temples, and wearing a black woolen cloak, but on her feet was a pair of narrow black embroidered shoes with white satin, rolled tops, and a white crab claw chrysanthemum embroidered on the toe. Hong Kai followed her out and took the lead. He stepped forward and introduced, "This is Mrs. He. This is my mother-in-law." This is my wife. Mrs. He did not come over, but only led her from a distance. He nodded with a smile, nodded and smiled with Hong Kai, and left with the child. Hong Kai walked over and sat down next to Mrs. Gu, teasing and chatting with Mrs. Gu. He stayed with them all the time, went in to see the doctor together, came out, and went back together. He himself felt guilty, in fact. He was not afraid of anything else about today's incident. He was afraid that Manzin would have an attack on the spot. Since it didn't happen, that was for the best. Even if things went wrong in the future, he wouldn't be afraid of what would happen to her, but he couldn't tell what kind of mentality he had towards Manzin. Sometimes he tried to insult her, but sometimes he felt a slight sense of inexplicable fear. He gave his own tricycle to Mrs. Gu and Manzin, and hired another one for himself. Mrs. Gu always felt scared riding a tricycle, so Chen Yuan pedaled very slowly and gradually fell behind. Mrs. Gu wanted to talk to Manzin about the woman just now on the way, but she was in Chen Yuan's way because she was afraid that he would overhear her. Manzin asked Chen Yuan to go to a pharmacy, buy 2 medicines according to the doctor's prescription, and then go home. Hong Kai had already arrived home and was sitting in the living room reading the evening newspaper. Mrs. Gu was tired after such a trip. She wanted to lie down for a while, so she went upstairs to get dressed and sleep. She took out the pills and took them. When she saw Manzin walking by the door, she shouted, "Hey, come on, show me what this instruction manual says." Manzin walked in, picked up the instruction manual for the pills and read it, but Mrs. Gu raised her head from the pillow and saw no one around. He looked at her and smiled and said, "That woman didn't know what was going on just now." Manzin smiled faintly and said, "Yes, judging from their sneaky looks, they must be his maternal wife." Mrs. Gu sighed. "Let me tell you, if Hong Kai is making trouble at home now, is there someone outside? Girl, I'm not telling you. It's your fault. You put your whole heart on your child. You don't take Hong Kai seriously. Don't you know his temper? You have to win over him a little bit." Manzin just lowered his head and read the instructions. Seeing that she was always silent, Mrs. Gu thought that it was strange for Manzin. She usually quarreled with Hong Kai over trivial matters. If such a thing happened, she couldn't let him go lightly. She seemed to be very tolerant. As if letting go, why is this child so confused? It is said that as the mother-in-law, I can only resolve the situation and not instigate it, but it is really worrying. Manzin was still too careless about money, and didn't even think about saving a few private houses. She simply felt that Hong Sai's money came from an illegitimate source and simply didn't want to ask anything about it. Mrs. Gu thinks this is very unwise. She was silent for a moment, and then said again, "I know you don't like to hear what I said. I have been living with you for these days, and I have been watching from the side. I have wanted to persuade you for a long time. If nothing else, while he still has plenty of money, you should save some money yourself. Seeing how you guys are arguing all day long, if there is a quarrel and he doesn't come up with the household money, it's better to have some money in your own hands. I don't know what you have in mind." When she said this, she couldn't help but feel a sense of loneliness. There was something that her children never wanted to tell her. She sighed again and said, "Hey, I see you guys are noisy all day long. It's really worrying." Manzin rolled her eyes and smiled. "It's true. I also know that Mom is annoyed. After 2 days when Mom gets better, why not stay at Wyman's place for a few days and have some peace and quiet?" Mrs. Gu never expected that her daughter would issue an eviction order, so she was startled for a moment and said, "That's good too." Then she thought about it. Manzin must have made up his mind to make a big fuss with Hong Kai and ask him to sever ties with the woman. There must be a fierce quarrel this time, so he asked her to stay away so that she wouldn't get in the way. Mrs. Gu thought about it for a while, but felt a little worried again, so she warned again, "I can't hold it in, and I have to say it again. If you want to make trouble with him, don't break up too much. You have to leave him some time. It's a little better. You see, the child just now is already that big, and that person is more than a year old. And it may be before you get married to him. If this goes on for a long time, it may be difficult to ask her to leave." Manzin nodded slightly. Before Mrs. Gu could continue to say something, a woman's voice suddenly shouted second sister at the top of the stairs. Mrs. Gu was blinded for a moment and quickly asked Manzin softly, "Who?" Manzin couldn't remember for a moment. It turned out to be her sister-in-law Wanju, walking in with a smile. Manzin hurriedly asked her to sit down, and Wanju said with a smile, "Wyman is here too. Is Mom feeling better?" Just as he was talking, Hong Kai also accompanied Wyman upstairs. Hong Kai was also very perfunctory with Wyman and his wife today. He said, "It's rare for you two to come here. Bring Jimin and let's liven things up." He immediately forced Wyman to make a phone call and ordered the servants to go to the restaurant to order food. Then he smiled and said, "Don't you love playing mahjong, Mom? I just happened to play a few rounds today." Although Mrs. Gu had no intention of having fun, seeing that Manzin remained calm and composed, she had no choice but to be easygoing. The maid immediately set up the mahjong table, and the Wyman couple and Hong Kai accompanied Mrs. Gu to play. Soon Jimin also came. Manzin sat with him and talked. Jimin asked, "Where is Rongbao?" Stood far away, and when Jimin talked to him, he didn't show much resistance. Mrs. Gu turned around and said with a smile, "What's wrong today? You don't like your uncle?" Without seeing him, Rongbao had already slipped away. Jimin walked over and stood behind Mrs. Gu to read the cards. The strong lights on the card table illuminated their faces. Looking from where Manzin sat, she had a strange feeling, as if the circle of people sitting and standing under the lights were far away from her. Far away, even the laughter sounded unusually faint. This matter that she was planning in her heart, none of her family members could discuss it. Needless to say, her mother must not let her know. If she finds out, she will not only panic, but also try her best to stop it. As for Wyman and Jimin, although they have never had a good impression of Hong Kai, they originally disapproved of her marriage to him. But now that they have been married for several years, if they get divorced at this time, they will definitely still disapproved. Originally, in a situation like hers, once a woman reaches the age of 30, as long as her husband is not absolutely abusive to her or does not support her at all, even if he gets someone else. Since it is not blatant, it can still be regarded as a face-saving act. If he had planned it for her, no one would think that she had a reason for divorce. Manzin could imagine that Wyman's mother-in-law would say she was crazy when she heard this. After she gets divorced, she may have to live in Wyman's house for a period of time, so she will have to squeeze in with her mother and Mrs. Tao, two old ladies. She smiled when she thought of this. While Hong Kai was playing cards, he looked at Manzin's face carefully and felt that she seemed very happy today. At least her face was a little more lively, not as lifeless as usual. He was thinking in his mind that she might not have been suspicious of anything just now. Even if she was a little suspicious, she was probably prepared to keep it quiet and not expose it. A stone fell from his heart, and he mentioned that he had a dinner party tonight and had to go out. He forced Jimin to sit down and fight for him, and he went out on a tricycle. Manzin thought in his heart that if he was really invited to dinner, Chen Yuan would definitely come back for dinner after a while. As a rule, if the host goes out to eat in a restaurant, although the driver gets a share of the meal, he often rides back home to eat and save the money. Manzin said to the maid, "If Chen Yuan comes back for dinner, you ask him to come. I will take care of him if I have anything to say. I want to ask him to buy something." The food ordered from the restaurant has been delivered. After finishing the round, they had their meal and continued playing cards after the meal. Manzin went upstairs alone, took the key and opened the cabinet door. She didn't have much money at hand, so she took it out and was counting it. Chen Yuan came upstairs and stood at the door of the room. Manzin asked him to come in, then handed a roll of banknotes to his hand and said with a smile, "This is the old lady gave it to you just now." Chen Yuan saw that it was a very thick stack, and it was all big bills. "I have never been given such a large amount of money. I can't tell that the old lady outside is not amazing in appearance. He looks like a country boy, but he is so aggressive." He couldn't help but smile all over his face and said, "Hey, thank you, old lady." He also had some idea in his mind, thinking that the money must have come from his wife. And it wasn't because he saw the old man and that woman together at the doctor's today, acting suspiciously. Only the driver knows the actions of the gentleman best, so you have to ask him. Sure enough, his guess was right. Manzin went outside to take a look. She also knew that the maids were eating downstairs, but she still closed the door cautiously. Then she interrogated him. She just pretended that she already knew everything. Just ask where the woman lives. At first, Chen Yuan refused to know, saying that he had just seen the woman today. She must have gone to the dormitory to find the master. He took them from the dormitory to the doctor, and later he saw her taking them alone. The child came out first, and another car was asked to leave. When Manzin heard that he was relying on him, he smiled and said, I must have told you not to talk about it. It doesn't matter. Just tell me and I won't embarrass you. She also promised him some benefits. She is usually very polite to the servants, but if she really offends her, of course she is in danger of being fired. Moreover, Chen Yuan also knew that she always kept her word and would never let the master know that it was him who leaked the secret. At that moment, he relaxed and not only told the truth about the woman's address, but also her origins. Tell the truth, it turned out that the woman was the concubine of He Jianru, a friend of Hong Sai's. When Hong Kai introduced her, he said she was Mrs. He, which was true. When He Jianru broke up with her, he asked Hong Kai to negotiate terms for him. That's how I got to know her. And they finally lived together. This was the spring of last year. Chen Yuan added. This woman also has a troubled daughter, the one who went to see a doctor today. Manzin was very surprised by this, and it turned out that the child was not Hong Sai's. The little girl was holding Hong Sai's hat and playing with it. For some reason, that gesture left a deep impression on her. The child seemed so kind to Hong Kai, which seemed to be a reflection of father's love. Hong Kai must have always loved her very much. He must be very miserable at home, but if he is with other people's children, maybe he can taste a little family happiness. When Manzin thought this, a faint bitter smile appeared on his lips. She felt this was an irony of fate. Although she has been in pain all these years, he has not been able to find happiness. I think it's for the sake of the children, because the children are also burdened with the consequences. When she thought of sacrificing herself, she originally had a suicidal mood. If you really commit suicide, it will be over if you die, but life is more terrifying than death. Life can continue to develop without limit, becoming worse and worse, even more unbearable than the most unbearable state originally imagined. She was leaning on a corner of the table and thinking blankly. Chen Yuan had already gone downstairs. You can faintly hear the crisp sound of shuffling carts downstairs. The room was extremely quiet, except for the subtle chirping sound made by the blue-white fluorescent lamp. The biggest problem at hand is still the children. Even though Hong Kai beat and scolded Rongbao all day long, he still refused to let Manzin take him away. Don't say that he is such a son, even if he has 3 or 4 more. According to their kind of mentality, they still think that they can't let any of their own flesh and blood be lost outside. Although Hong Kai now has something in Manzin's hands, if she can find real evidence about his affair with that woman, she can sue him. She should be legally allowed to divorce, and the child should be awarded to her. But if he spends as much money as possible for sports, the outcome is still uncertain. So it's still a question of money. She was holding a rubber band that had just tied up the banknotes in her hand. She kept stretching it and flicking it. The bullet was too heavy and it hurt her hand very much. Now is the time to go out and look for trouble. It can be said that the timing cannot be worse. All legitimate businesses are at a standstill. There are only layoffs and absolutely no additions. And she is not that young anymore. Does she still have the spirit to make a way out of the middle of nowhere? Problems in future life will always be relatively easy to solve, and she still has confidence in this. But where is the current expense going to be managed? Litigation requires money. When there was really no other way, she could even escape from the occupied area with her children. Or the treasure should be hidden in advance, lest the late emperor resort to desperate means to kidnap the child and not let him go. She suddenly remembered that Kai Jinfeng had come to leave the child with them, which would have been inappropriate. Hong Kai had no idea she had such a close friend. She and Jin Feng haven't seen each other for many years. I wonder if they still live there. Since she married Hong Kai, she had not been to their house because she had been so impassioned in front of Jin Feng before, but she went back on her word. She really had no face to inform Jin Feng of her marriage. Thinking about it now, she really hated herself for doing something wrong. What happened in the past was Hong Sai's fault, and she shouldn't have married him later. She was wrong.
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.